Have you ever been stuck between what you know is right and something that's just a little too tempting? We've all been there, whether it's a decision about work, relationships, or even something as simple as eating that extra slice of cake when you know you shouldn't. It's like this inner battle where one part of you says, "Don't do it, you know better," but the other part is like, "But what's the harm? Just this once." And that's exactly where we find Balaam at the start of this story. Stuck between doing what he knows is right and taking a tempting offer that, at first glance, seems too good to pass up. So who is Balaam? He's not your average prophet. Balaam was a non-Israelite prophet who had a pretty unique relationship with God. In fact, he's one of the few figures in the Bible who wasn't an Israelite, yet had direct communication with God. That alone makes him stand out. But here's where things get tricky. Balaam finds himself being courted by Balak, the king of Moab. Balak is terrified of the Israelites, who've been sweeping through the land like an unstoppable force. In a desperate move, Balak sends messengers to Balaam with a tempting offer. "Come curse the Israelites, and I'll make you rich." And not just rich, really rich. Now, who wouldn't pause for a moment at an offer like that? But here's where Balaam's struggle begins. God already told Balaam no. It's clear as day, don't go with them, don't curse the Israelites. And yet, that offer keeps calling his name, like that second slice of cake staring at you from the fridge. Balak isn't giving up easily either. He sends more important messengers with even more promises of wealth and power. You can almost feel Balaam's internal dialogue playing out. "I know I shouldn't, but maybe I can just go along for the ride. Maybe I'll see how things turn out." It's the classic human dilemma, being pulled between doing what's right and what's easy, or in this case, what's profitable. And who can't relate to that? We've all had moments where we know what the right decision is, but we still toy with the idea of doing something else just to see how it pans out. It's like when you're on a diet and someone offers you a donut. You know you're trying to be good, but there's that voice in your head saying, "One won't hurt," right? Balaam's situation feels a lot like that, only on a much larger scale, with much bigger consequences. It's not just about the money for Balaam, though. There's something deeper going on. He's torn between his connection with God and the pull of worldly rewards. It's the age-old struggle of integrity versus temptation. Balaam isn't evil, but he's human. He's wrestling with the same kinds of temptations we all face. And that's what makes his story so relatable. We all have our Balaam moments, where the right path is clear, but the wrong one is glittering and enticing. Balaam knows what he should do, but he's struggling with the lure of what's being offered to him. It's kind of like when you see a sale for something you don't really need, but the price is just so good, you convince yourself to buy it anyway. You know deep down you shouldn't, but you do it. That's Balaam, standing at a crossroads, knowing which way leads to God's approval and which way leads to a whole lot of gold from Balak. As we dive deeper into Balaam's journey, keep this tension in mind. It's easy to think, how could he not just say no? But then again, how many times have we found ourselves rationalizing decisions we know aren't the best for us, just because the temptation is too strong? Balaam's story is about more than just a prophet, a donkey, and an angel. It's a story about the inner battles we all face and what happens when we let temptation get the best of us. And trust me, things are about to get a whole lot more complicated for Balaam and a lot more interesting for us. So stick with me, because this journey is just getting started, and there's a lot more to learn from our unlikely hero and his equally unlikely companion, the donkey. So Balaam, after a lot of back and forth with God's instructions, decides to go with Balak's men. Now, this isn't exactly the move God wanted him to make, but Balaam is set on his journey, despite the clear warnings he's already received. Imagine Balaam, all geared up, determined to follow through with his plan. He's probably thinking, "I've got this under control." But the reality, not so much. Here's where things start to get interesting, because Balaam isn't traveling alone. He's got his trusty donkey with him, and let me tell you, this donkey is not your average ride. In fact, if you think of the donkey as a modern-day overworked Uber driver who's just trying to get through the day without any drama, you'll get the picture. The donkey is about to become the voice of reason in this story, literally. Now imagine the scene. Balaam is riding his donkey along a dusty road, determined to reach Balak. The sun is probably beating down, the road ahead looks endless, and Balaam, in his stubbornness, just wants to get there and be done with it. But here's the thing, his donkey has other ideas. The donkey, unlike Balaam, sees what's really going on. And what does the donkey see? An angel of the Lord standing in the middle of the road with a drawn sword? Yeah, that's right. A full-on, warrior-like angel blocking the path. But here's the kicker. Balaam can't see the angel at all. Talk about frustrating. Balaam is oblivious, and his donkey, well, she's not having it. The donkey swerves off the road, trying to avoid the angel. Balaam, not understanding why his ride is suddenly taking a detour, starts getting frustrated. I mean, can you imagine being in an Uber and your driver just decides to veer off the highway? You'd be like, what's going on here? That's Balaam, totally confused and probably a bit irritated. He's not seeing the bigger picture. So Balaam does what anyone in his position might do. He tries to force the donkey back onto the road. He hits her, trying to get her to cooperate, completely missing the fact that she's trying to save him from, a massive angel with a sword. And isn't that just like us sometimes? We get so focused on what we want, what we're determined to do, that we miss the signs right in front of us. We ignore the people or situations trying to steer us away from danger because we're dead set on our own plans. Let's be real, we've all been there. Maybe it was a career path that seemed perfect on paper, but deep down you had that nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Or maybe it was a relationship where the red flags were practically waving in your face, but you just kept pushing forward, convinced that you could make it work. And then, when things inevitably started going off course, you blamed everything but the situation itself. That's exactly what Balaam is doing here. He's not seeing the truth of the situation. He's too focused on getting to his destination. But the donkey, she's fully aware, and she's not about to march headfirst into a divine roadblock. It's like when someone in your life tries to give you advice, but you're just not ready to hear it. They're pointing out the pitfalls, trying to save you from yourself, but you're too stubborn to listen. As Balaam's journey continues, the tension builds. The donkey tries again to avoid the angel, this time pressing Balaam's foot against a wall. Ouch! You can imagine Balaam losing his temper at this point. After all, he's just trying to get where he's going, and now his foot is hurting. He hits the donkey again, thinking she's just being difficult. But what's really happening is that she's seeing something he can't. And isn't that true in life? How many times have we pushed forward with our own plans, ignoring the signs, only to end up hurting ourselves in the process? By this point, Balaam is probably fuming, and the poor donkey is doing everything in her power to avoid the angel. But Balaam, he's still completely in the dark. And that's the thing about being stubborn. You're often the last to realize you're the problem. It's a lot like when you're driving somewhere and your GPS is telling you to make a turn, but you're convinced you know a better route. You keep ignoring the instructions, sure that you've got it under control, only to end up stuck in traffic or, worse, completely lost. That's Balaam, ignoring the signs, stubbornly pushing forward, convinced that he knows best. But the donkey knows something Balaam doesn't. She's seen the angel, and she knows that moving forward would be a disaster. If only Balaam would listen, things might go a lot smoother. But we all know what it's like to ignore that inner voice, or in Balaam's case, the literal voice of a donkey, only to realize later that we should have paid attention. So the journey continues, the tension mounts, and Balaam's frustration grows. What he doesn't know is that his donkey is about to do something that will completely flip the script on this whole situation. So here we are. Balaam is still stubbornly pushing forward on his journey, and his poor donkey is doing her best to keep him safe. And this is where the story takes a turn for the unexpected. Balaam is oblivious to the danger ahead, but his donkey, she sees everything. There in the middle of the road stands the angel of the Lord, sword drawn, blocking their path. Now this isn't just any angel. This is an angel sent to stop Balaam in his tracks, and yet Balaam has no clue. But the donkey, oh, she knows. She sees the angel and immediately decides, yeah, we're not going that way. So what does she do? She swerves off the road. You can almost imagine Balaam sitting there, confused, thinking, why are we taking this detour? What's going on? He's completely blind to the fact that his donkey is trying to save his life. And isn't that just like life sometimes? We think we're headed in the right direction, only to have something or someone unexpected throw us off course. And we don't even realize it's for our own good. The donkey, bless her heart, is doing her best to avoid a literal divine intervention. And Balaam? Well, he's not having it. He's frustrated, probably muttering to himself, "Why is my ride acting up?" So he hits the donkey, trying to get her back on the road. But the donkey isn't giving up. She swerves again, and again Balaam is completely unaware of the danger right in front of him. How often in life do we find ourselves in situations where the thing or person we're frustrated with is actually trying to help us? It's like when your GPS keeps rerouting you and you're thinking, why is this thing glitching? Only to realize later that it was saving you from a traffic jam. At this point, the donkey stops completely, refusing to go forward. And then, get ready for it, the donkey speaks. Yes, you heard that right. The donkey opens her mouth and asks Balaam, "What have I done to you to make you hit me 3 times?" I mean, can you imagine? Balaam must have been completely shocked. A talking donkey. It's like something out of a fairy tale or a Disney movie. And yet, here it is in the Bible. Now let's pause for a moment and think about this. Balaam is so caught up in his own mission that it doesn't even seem to register that his donkey is talking to him. He's more focused on his frustration than on the miracle happening right in front of him. How often do we miss the profound truths that come from the most unlikely places because we're too wrapped up in our own plans? This part of the story is a bit like those moments in life when someone you least expect says something that makes you stop and think. Maybe it's a child's innocent comment that cuts straight to the heart of a complicated situation. Or perhaps it's an offhand remark from a friend that ends up being the exact wisdom you needed to hear. I remember one time when I was debating a major life decision, and out of nowhere, a friend who wasn't even involved in the conversation made a simple, almost accidental comment. It was something like, sometimes the right choice is the one that feels the scariest. And that hit me like a ton of bricks. Here I was, overthinking every detail, and this one line gave me the clarity I needed. That's what's happening here with Balaam and the donkey. The donkey of all creatures is the one seeing things clearly, while Balaam, the prophet, is completely missing the point. It's a reminder that sometimes the most profound insights come from the least likely sources. So there they are, Balaam and his donkey in the middle of the road, having a full-on conversation. Balaam, still fuming, argues back, "You've made a fool of me. If I had a sword in my hand, I'd kill you right now." Talk about missing the bigger picture. Balaam is so focused on getting where he wants to go that he's willing to take out his frustration on the one trying to save him. The donkey, of course, stays calm. She reminds Balaam that she's been his faithful companion for years and has never acted like this before. In other words, if I'm acting strange, maybe there's a reason for it. And that's when Balaam's eyes are finally opened. He sees the angel standing there, sword in hand, and suddenly everything makes sense. The detours, the stubbornness of his donkey, it was all to protect him from walking straight into disaster. How often do we experience this in our own lives? We get frustrated when things don't go our way, when our plans hit a roadblock, and yet looking back, we often see that those obstacles were there for a reason. Maybe it was to protect us from something we couldn't see at the time. Maybe it was to steer us in a different direction, one we didn't even know we needed to take. So next time you find yourself annoyed with the donkey in your life, whether it's a friend, a situation, or even that voice inside you that's telling you to stop and reconsider, remember Balaam's story. Sometimes the most unlikely messengers are the ones who save us from ourselves. And just like that, Balaam's eyes are opened. Imagine the scene. The prophet, who was so stubbornly focused on his mission, suddenly standing face to face with an angel wielding a sword. It's a light bulb moment, but instead of just flicking on in his mind, it feels like the whole world has shifted around him. The angel had been there the whole time, standing in plain sight. Yet Balaam had been completely blind to it. It's almost comical in a way. Here he was, thinking he had everything under control, only to realize that he'd been on the brink of disaster the whole time. It's one of those moments that makes you cringe, thinking back on times when you, too, were so fixated on something that you missed the obvious signs right in front of you. Like when you've been looking for your glasses for 15 minutes, only to find they've been on top of your head the entire time. We've all had those moments where you realize how close you were to making a huge mistake, and suddenly everything falls into place. But this moment for Balaam isn't just embarrassing, it's humbling. He's standing in front of an angel of the Lord, the very messenger sent to stop him from walking into his own destruction. Balaam, the prophet who prided himself on his spiritual insight, was completely blind to the reality of the situation. It's almost ironic that his donkey, a creature we usually associate with stubbornness, was the one who saw clearly all along. This part of Balaam's story hits home because, let's be real, how often do we miss the bigger picture because we're too caught up in our own plans? Maybe it's in our careers, when we're chasing success so single-mindedly that we overlook the warning signs of burnout. Or maybe it's in relationships, where we're so focused on making things work that we miss the fact that we're headed in the wrong direction. Balaam's blindness is a reminder that sometimes we need to stop and ask ourselves, am I really seeing the whole picture here? There's a spiritual depth to this realization too. Just like Balaam, we can get so wrapped up in what we think is right that we forget to listen for the still, small voice guiding us. Sometimes that voice comes from the most unlikely places. A conversation with a stranger, a child's innocent question, or even a seemingly random event. But if we're not paying attention, we might miss it completely. It's kind of like those moments when you're watching a movie and hours later, you finally understand a joke that flew over your head the first time. You sit there, shaking your head, laughing at yourself for how long it took to get it. Balaam's moment of realization feels like that, only on a much larger, more divine scale. It's not just a gotcha moment, it's a turning point in his life. He realizes that everything he had been pushing for, all his stubbornness, had been leading him straight into disaster. And it took a talking donkey and an angel to make him see the truth. I remember a time when I had one of those delayed epiphanies. I was driving to a meeting, completely stressed out about making a good impression, and I missed my turn. Instead of just accepting it and turning around, I kept driving, convinced that I could find another way back. Well, after an hour of stubbornly refusing to listen to my GPS, I ended up completely lost, on a dirt road no less. It wasn't until then that I finally gave in, turned around, and followed the original route. Looking back, it's almost laughable how determined I was to make my own way, even though the signs were there from the start. That's what's happening to Balaam here. He thought he knew best, thought he was in control, but it took a divine intervention and a stubborn donkey for him to realize just how wrong he was. It's a powerful moment of humility, one that speaks to all of us. How many times have we been too focused on our own plans, too stubborn to admit we were wrong, only to be saved from ourselves in the most unexpected ways? As Balaam stands there, finally seeing the angel, you can almost feel the weight of the situation sink in. He wasn't just on the wrong path, he was headed towards something far more dangerous than he ever realized. And in that moment of clarity, all his frustration, his stubbornness, and his pride melt away. He sees the truth now, and that truth changes everything. So there Balaam is, standing in disbelief as his donkey, yes, his donkey, starts talking. This has to be one of the most surreal moments in the Bible. Imagine it. Balaam is fuming, frustrated that his donkey won't cooperate, and then out of nowhere, she starts speaking. Now, we've all been caught off guard by something strange in life, but a talking donkey? That's next level. You can almost picture Balaam doing a double take, like, wait, did that just happen? And the donkey isn't just making random noises. She's actually calling Balaam out, saying, "What have I done to you to make you hit me 3 times?" It's one of those moments where life throws something so unexpected at you that you can't help but stop in your tracks. And Balaam, for all his wisdom as a prophet, is caught completely off guard by it. This scene is both funny and profound. Here's Balaam, a man who considers himself wise and powerful, getting a reality check from the most unlikely of creatures. It's like when you're all stressed out in overthinking something, and then your dog comes up and gives you that look. Like, really? Are you sure this is what we're doing right now? Sometimes animals seem to know things we don't, and this donkey has wisdom beyond what Balaam could even imagine. This part of the story hits home because how often do we dismiss advice or insight just because it comes from a source we didn't expect? Maybe it's a coworker who we don't usually take seriously, but suddenly they drop a piece of wisdom that changes our perspective. Or maybe it's a stranger who says something in passing that makes us rethink our whole approach. And sometimes it's the smallest voice in our own minds, the one we've been ignoring, that holds the answer we've been searching for. Let's face it, we're all guilty of missing those moments. We get caught up in our own plans, convinced that we know what's best, and we overlook the subtle, often unexpected ways that life tries to give us a nudge in the right direction. Balaam had a literal talking donkey to wake him up. How's that for a plot twist? And that's the beauty of this story. God can use anyone or anything to get through to us. Whether it's a talking donkey, a random comment from a stranger, or even a frustrating situation that seems to have no solution, there's always something to learn if we're willing to listen. The Bible is full of moments where the most unlikely messengers carry the most profound wisdom. And Balaam's donkey is just one example of how God works in ways that we can't always predict or understand. It reminds me of a time when I was dealing with a tough decision at work. I had been going over the problem again and again, convinced that there was no easy way out. One day I'm having coffee with a coworker, and in the middle of a completely unrelated conversation, they say something offhand like, "You know, sometimes the simplest solution is the best one." And just like that, it clicked. I had been so focused on finding a complicated answer that I had overlooked the obvious. Balaam's donkey is like that coworker or friend who drops a truth bomb when you least expect it. She's not trying to be fancy or profound. She's just stating the obvious. But sometimes that's exactly what we need to hear. And in Balaam's case, it took a literal divine intervention for him to finally stop and pay attention. This part of the story serves as a reminder that wisdom doesn't always come from where we expect it. It might not be the person with the most experience or the loudest voice. Sometimes it's the quiet nudge, the unlikely messenger, the person or situation that you didn't see coming that brings you the clarity you need. So the next time you find yourself ignoring advice because it doesn't come from the right source, think back to Balaam's donkey. If God can use a donkey to get through to a prophet, then maybe we should be a little more open to the unexpected sources of wisdom in our own lives. After all, you never know when that seemingly random comment might be the thing that changes everything. After all the commotion with the donkey, Balaam finally has his moment of reckoning. The angel standing before him, sword drawn, is no longer invisible, and it's clear that Balaam's been on the wrong path, both figuratively and literally. You can almost picture the look on his face when it hits him. Here he was, thinking he had everything under control, only to find out that his own donkey had more sense than he did. In that moment, Balaam does something that many of us struggle with. He admits he was wrong. Now let's be honest, apologizing isn't exactly fun. No one likes being wrong, let alone having to admit it. It's like swallowing a bitter pill. But Balaam, he owns up to it. He apologizes to the angel and acknowledges that he didn't see what was right in front of him. There's a certain humility in that, and it's something we can all relate to. Think about it. How many times have we been in situations where we ignored advice, warnings, or our own instincts, only to realize later that we messed up? Maybe it was an argument where you were so sure you were right, only to find out that you had misunderstood the situation. Or maybe it was a decision you made, one that everyone else warned you against, but you just had to go through with it. Then months later, when it all goes sideways, you have that sinking feeling in your stomach, knowing that you should have listened. Balaam's story is a reminder that there's power in admitting we're wrong, even when it's not easy. I remember a time when I had to admit I was wrong. I was convinced that a certain shortcut on my commute was going to save me tons of time. I raved about it to everyone. "You've got to try this route. It's so much faster." Well, one day I stubbornly took my shortcut, ignoring a few detours and road signs because I was so sure I knew better. Long story short, I ended up stuck in traffic for hours. When I finally got home, my friends were all too eager to say, "So how'd that shortcut work out for you?" I had no choice but to laugh it off and admit they were right all along. It's those humbling moments where we learn the most. For Balaam, this was more than just a minor mistake. His actions had serious consequences, and he realized that if he hadn't been stopped, he could have walked straight into disaster. But his willingness to apologize, to turn back from his stubbornness, is what makes this part of the story so powerful. It shows that even when we're wrong, it's never too late to change course. There's something freeing about letting go of our pride and admitting we've made a mistake. We've all had those moments in life where we've pushed forward, ignoring all the signs that told us to stop, only to end up in a situation we never wanted to be in. And when the realization hits, it can be hard to swallow our pride and admit, okay, I was wrong. But Balaam's story shows us that it's not the mistake that defines us. It's how we respond to it. Admitting you're wrong doesn't make you weak. In fact, it's a sign of strength. It's a moment of clarity, of humility, where you get to course correct and avoid further damage. And let's not forget, Balaam's donkey played a huge role in this revelation. If it weren't for that unlikely messenger, Balaam might have kept on going, blind to the danger ahead. It's a reminder that sometimes the thing or person we least expect to be right is the one showing us the way. It's humbling, and maybe even a little funny, when we realize that we've been outsmarted by someone or something we never saw as wise. But in the end, what matters is that Balaam repented. He acknowledged his mistake, admitted that he had been wrong, and allowed himself to be redirected. That's the real lesson here. No matter how far we've gone down the wrong path, there's always a way back. It just takes a bit of humility and the willingness to admit, okay, I didn't have it all figured out after all. So the next time you find yourself digging your heels in, insisting that you know best, remember Balaam and his talking donkey. Sometimes it's the most unexpected voices that show us the truth, and when we see it, there's no shame in saying, I was wrong. It's not a defeat, it's a moment of growth, one that leads us closer to where we're meant to be. Balaam's moment of repentance was powerful. Here's a man who's been put in his place by a talking donkey. Yes, a donkey, and an angel standing in his path with a sword. You'd think that would be enough to set him straight for good, right? But as with many of us, that moment of clarity isn't always the end of the story. It's funny how, even after realizing we're wrong, even after having that epiphany, there's still a part of us that can get pulled back into the same patterns. It's like we see the truth, we promise to do better, but something in the background keeps tugging at us. And for Balaam, that something was the lure of wealth and power. Even after this dramatic divine intervention, he still couldn't quite shake his desire for personal gain. Think about it. How many times have you promised yourself you wouldn't fall into the same trap, only to find yourself right back where you started? Maybe it's a habit you swore you'd kick, or a situation you promised you'd avoid, but somehow it always pulls you back. It's like Balaam is all of us in that moment, standing there apologizing, but still wrestling with the deeper issue inside him. But here's the twist. Balaam's story doesn't end with his apology. As much as he repented in the moment, that temptation was still there, simmering under the surface. And while he had this brief moment of clarity, that wasn't enough to stop what was coming next. Balaam was still caught in the web of his own desires, and that's where things start to unravel again. Let's be real. It's easy to look at Balaam and think, man, how could you mess up again after everything you just went through? Didn't the talking donkey teach you anything? But if we're honest, we've all had our Balaam moments. You know, those times when we think we've learned our lesson, only to fall back into the same behavior a week, a month, or even a year later. Whether it's ignoring that inner voice or pushing aside the advice of others, sometimes the hardest thing to do is stay on the path after we've made the first step in the right direction. What Balaam does next is almost inevitable. Despite his apology, despite seeing the angel, that temptation for personal gain didn't just disappear. He still wanted the reward Balak had offered him to curse the Israelites. And though he didn't go forward with the curse at that moment, that desire lingered, waiting for its chance to resurface. It's almost like a battle inside him. On the one hand, he knows what's right. But on the other, the allure of riches and recognition is just too strong. It reminds me of those moments when you've made a decision to walk away from something that's not good for you, only to find yourself still thinking about it later. Maybe it's like trying to quit junk food, but as soon as you drive past your favorite fast food place, the cravings start up again. Or maybe it's more serious, walking away from a toxic relationship, but still feeling that pull to go back, even when you know it's not good for you. For Balaam, the pull of personal gain didn't go away, and eventually it would come back to haunt him. What happens next in his story is a lesson for all of us. No matter how sincere our repentance might be in the moment, we have to stay vigilant because those old temptations have a way of creeping back in when we least expect them. The thing is, Balaam didn't just go right back to his old ways immediately. He had some time, maybe even convinced himself that he'd turned over a new leaf. But as time passed, that little voice of temptation grew louder and louder. It's a classic case of knowing what's right, but still wanting what's wrong. And eventually, Balaam made a choice that would have devastating consequences, not just for him, but for the people he was supposed to be leading. So what did Balaam finally do? How could someone who had such a dramatic, life-changing experience still fall back into the same trap? Well, it just goes to show that one moment of clarity isn't always enough. It's what we do after the moment passes that really defines us. You might be wondering, what could he have possibly done after all that? The truth is, Balaam's story takes a turn that will leave you questioning how easily we can slip back into old habits, even when we think we've moved on. What happens next is a reminder that even after the biggest wake-up calls, the battle isn't over. In fact, for Balaam, the real battle was just beginning. We've all had those moments in life when we thought we were done with something, ready to move forward and never look back. But then, days, weeks, or even years later, that thing we thought we left behind starts creeping back in. And for Balaam, that's exactly what happened. His story is about more than just a talking donkey and a moment of repentance. It's about the ongoing struggle to stay on the right path when the wrong one keeps calling your name. What happens next for Balaam is a cautionary tale about the choices we make after we think we've learned our lesson. It's a reminder that the pull of temptation is strong, and if we're not careful, we can find ourselves right back where we started, even after a miraculous intervention. Stay tuned, because the next part of Balaam's story is where things really start to get interesting. Let's fast forward a bit in Balaam's story to the part that often gets overshadowed by the more dramatic moments of the talking donkey and angel encounter. We've already seen how Balaam had this moment of repentance, this realization that he was on the wrong path. He apologized, changed direction, and for a brief moment, it seemed like everything was back on track. But as we hinted before, the allure of personal gain never really left him. Now here's where things get even more interesting. Balaam doesn't go back to cursing the Israelites immediately. After his encounter with the angel, he does try to do the right thing. He blesses the Israelites instead of cursing them. And this happens not just once, but 3 times. Imagine Balak's face during all of this. He hired Balaam, paying him handsomely to curse these people, and instead, Balaam is standing there, offering blessings. Balak must have been beside himself, wondering, what is going on? This was not the plan. You'd think that would be the end of it, right? Balaam does the right thing, blesses Israel, and walks away a changed man. But remember what we said about temptation. It doesn't just go away because you've made one good choice. It lingers, waiting for the right moment to strike again. And for Balaam, that temptation never really disappeared. His desire for wealth and recognition was still gnawing at him, even after doing what God commanded. Here's the thing about Balaam. He's a complicated figure. On the surface, he seems to have learned his lesson. But deep down, there's still a part of him that can't let go of the rewards Balak promised. And even though he didn't outright curse Israel, he found a way to accomplish the same goal, just in a more roundabout and dangerous way. This is where Balaam's story takes a dark turn. After blessing Israel 3 times, Balaam doesn't just walk away and live happily ever after. No, he sticks around. He's still in Balak's orbit, and somewhere along the way, he devises a plan, one that would lead to Israel's downfall without him having to utter a single curse. And this right here is where Balaam's legacy becomes so tainted. What Balaam couldn't do with words, he decided to do through manipulation. Here's how it went down. Instead of cursing Israel directly, Balaam gave Balak some advice. He told him, if you can't defeat Israel through war or curses, then you can bring them down in another way, through their own disobedience. Balaam knew that Israel had a covenant with God, one that required them to remain pure and faithful to him. If they broke that covenant, if they disobeyed God, they would bring destruction upon themselves. And so Balaam encouraged Balak to send Moabite women into Israel's camp to seduce the Israelite men and lead them into idolatry. And it worked. Balaam's plan set off a chain of events that led to a massive moral and spiritual failure among the Israelites. The Israelite men fell into temptation, marrying the Moabite women and worshiping their gods, particularly Baal of Peor. This idolatry angered God so much that a plague broke out among the Israelites, killing 24,000 people. So while Balaam didn't directly curse Israel, his advice to Balak was just as deadly, if not more so. Think about that for a second. Balaam found a way to get what he wanted, personal gain, wealth, and recognition, without outright defying God's command. He found a loophole. But here's the catch. God sees through all of it. Balaam's actions may have been indirect, but they were no less destructive. His manipulation led to the downfall of thousands of Israelites, and in the end, he still bore the weight of responsibility. Now, this is where we can really start drawing some parallels to our own lives. How many times have we tried to justify something we know is wrong by finding a loophole? Maybe we're not outright lying, but we're bending the truth just enough to get what we want. Maybe we're not directly disobeying, but we're skirting the edge of what we know is right, thinking we can get away with it. Balaam's story is a cautionary tale for all of us. A reminder that just because we don't technically do something wrong doesn't mean we're in the clear. The story of Balaam and Balak isn't just about curses and blessings. It's about the power of influence and how dangerous it can be when we use that influence for personal gain. Balaam didn't need to curse Israel with his words because his actions did the job for him. And that's something we see all the time in the world around us. People manipulating situations behind the scenes, pulling strings to get what they want, while keeping their hands clean on the surface. The Bible mentions Balaam again in several places, and it's never in a good light. In the New Testament, both 2 Peter and Jude refer to the way of Balaam, warning believers about the dangers of greed and leading others into sin. In Revelation, Jesus himself warns the church in Pergamum about those who follow the teaching of Balaam, leading people into idolatry and immorality. Balaam's name became synonymous with deception and greed, a stark reminder of what happens when we let our desires for wealth and power override our commitment to doing what's right. It's easy to look at Balaam and judge him for his actions. But if we're honest, we all have a little bit of Balaam in us, don't we? We've all been tempted by something that seems too good to pass up, even if it means bending our values just a little. Maybe it's a business deal that doesn't feel entirely ethical, but the payoff is too big to ignore. Or maybe it's a relationship where we know we're compromising our standards, but the allure of companionship is too strong. Balaam's story is a reminder that the decisions we make, especially the ones we think no one will notice, can have far-reaching consequences. What Balaam did in private, advising Balak to seduce the Israelites into idolatry, had devastating public consequences. And in the end, Balaam didn't get away with it. His story doesn't end with him riding off into the sunset, rich and powerful. Instead, Balaam was eventually killed by the sword during a battle between Israel and Midian, the very people he had conspired with. The Bible doesn't sugarcoat Balaam's fate. Numbers 31:8 tells us that Balaam was killed when the Israelites waged war against Midian. And later in verse 16, we're reminded that it was Balaam's advice that led to Israel's sin at Peor. In the end, Balaam's attempt to manipulate the situation for his own benefit didn't just lead to the destruction of others, it led to his own downfall as well. There's a sobering lesson here. Even when we think we found a clever way to bend the rules, there are consequences we can't always foresee. Balaam thought he could outsmart the situation, but in the end, his actions caught up with him. And that's something we can all learn from. So what do we take away from Balaam's story? It's not just a story about a man who talked to a donkey or a prophet who blessed instead of cursed. It's a story about the dangers of letting greed and personal ambition cloud our judgment. It's about the subtle ways we can compromise our values, thinking we're in control, only to find out that we've set off a chain of events we can't stop. Balaam's relationship with Balak serves as a warning for us today. Be careful who you align yourself with, and be mindful of the influence you wield over others. Whether we realize it or not, our actions can have ripple effects that go far beyond what we intended, and sometimes those ripple effects can come back to haunt us in ways we never expected. In the end, Balaam's story is one of both tragedy and caution. He was a man with the potential to do great things, but his inability to let go of personal gain led him down a path of destruction, not just for himself, but for others as well. And that's a lesson we would all do well to remember. So as we move forward, let Balaam's story be a reminder to stay vigilant against the temptations that can pull us off course, even after we think we've learned our lesson. Because as we've seen, it's not just the big decisions that matter, it's the little ones too. The ones we think no one will notice, the ones we justify to ourselves. Those are the choices that can make all the difference. And what happened to Balaam after this? Well, his story may have ended with his death, but his legacy, his teaching, lives on as a warning to us all. It's not enough to have one moment of clarity. The real test is staying true to the path, even when the temptations of the world try to pull us away. So we've come to the part of the story that gives us the real takeaway. What exactly does Balaam's donkey teach us? I mean, it's not every day that an animal becomes the star of a biblical lesson, right? But there's a lot packed into this moment that can speak to us today, especially when it comes to humility, listening to unexpected voices, and recognizing when we're blinded by our own ambitions. First off, there's a pretty clear lesson here about humility. Let's face it, Balaam was supposed to be this great, wise prophet, someone with a direct line to God. Yet it wasn't him who saw the angel standing in the road. It was his donkey. That's got to sting a little. Balaam thought he knew better, thought he had control over the situation, but in reality, he was the one who was blind to what was happening. And it took a talking donkey, probably the most unlikely messenger you could imagine, to wake him up. It's a reminder that no matter how much we think we know, no matter how wise or experienced we are, there are always moments when we can be humbled by the most unexpected sources. Maybe it's that coworker who usually doesn't say much, but then drops a piece of advice that shifts your whole perspective. Or maybe it's a child's innocent question that makes you rethink something you've been overcomplicating. In Balaam's case, his messenger was a donkey. In ours, it could be anyone or anything. It's about keeping an open mind and being willing to learn, even from the sources we least expect. And let's talk about those unexpected voices for a minute. How often do we brush aside advice because it comes from someone we don't think knows what they're talking about? Or we ignore a situation that seems too trivial to matter? Balaam was so focused on getting where he wanted to go, both literally and figuratively, that he couldn't see the warning signs all around him. It's easy to do that in our own lives too. We get tunnel vision, set on a goal, and we stop paying attention to the little signs or voices that might be trying to steer us in a better direction. I remember a time when I was working on a project at work, and I was so sure I knew the right way to do it. A junior colleague suggested an alternative approach, and I brushed it off, thinking, nah, they just don't get it. But after running into a few roadblocks, I realized that their suggestion was actually the key to solving the problem. It was a humbling moment, much like Balaam realizing his donkey was onto something the whole time. It's these small moments of humility that often teach us the biggest lessons. Now, the other big takeaway from Balaam's story is recognizing when we're being blinded by our own desires. Balaam wanted the wealth and recognition that Balak was offering, and that desire clouded his judgment. Even though God had clearly told him not to curse Israel, Balaam found himself making compromises. He couldn't see the bigger picture because he was so fixated on what he wanted. How relatable is that? We've all had those moments when we're so focused on our own goals that we miss the warning signs telling us to stop or reconsider. It could be in our careers, our relationships, or even personal projects. When we get too wrapped up in our own desires, we can become blind to the potential harm we're causing to ourselves and to others. Balaam's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of that kind of tunnel vision. And let's not forget the humor in all of this. The idea that a donkey, the most unlikely of messengers, ends up teaching a prophet a lesson. There's something kind of delightful about that. It reminds us to not take ourselves too seriously, to stay open to the unexpected, and to recognize that wisdom can come from the most surprising places. I mean, how many times have you been taught a profound lesson by something or someone you least expected? Maybe your dog's behavior made you reflect on your own patience, or a random stranger's comment made you rethink your perspective on something important. Life has a funny way of showing us the truth, even when we're not looking for it. I remember once when I was so caught up in getting through my to-do list that I wasn't really paying attention to anything else. My dog, who's usually pretty calm, suddenly started barking at the door and wouldn't stop. I thought it was just the mailman, so I ignored it. Turns out my neighbor's package had been left on the porch for hours and it was starting to rain. My dog was basically saying, "Hey, go help out." But I was too focused on my own tasks to notice. It was one of those moments where you think, well, I guess the universe has a way of getting your attention. So what do we take away from Balaam's donkey? First, humility. No matter how smart or experienced we think we are, there's always something new to learn, and often from the most surprising places. Second, keep your ears open to unexpected voices. Just because advice or insight comes from an unlikely source doesn't mean it's any less valuable. And third, be careful about letting your desires blind you. Balaam's story shows us the dangers of getting too caught up in what we want, rather than focusing on what's right. In the end, Balaam's donkey wasn't just a quirky part of the story. It was the key to unlocking a deeper lesson about humility, listening, and being open to correction. And if we can apply those lessons to our own lives, we might just find ourselves avoiding the kind of disaster Balaam almost walked into. So the next time you're tempted to ignore that small voice or that unexpected piece of advice, just remember Balaam's donkey. You never know when the least likely messenger might have the most profound wisdom to share. So where do we go from here? Balaam's story is more than just a tale of a stubborn prophet and his talking donkey. It's a mirror for all of us, a reminder to pause and think about how we approach life. I think it's fair to say we've all been in Balaam's shoes, so fixated on our own goals and plans that we miss the signals that are right in front of us. Maybe it's a friend who's been trying to offer advice we've ignored, or even that gut feeling we keep pushing aside because we think we know better. But let's be honest, we don't always know better, do we? This is where the story hits home. Balaam's blindness wasn't just physical, it was spiritual and emotional too. His desire for recognition, wealth, and success clouded his ability to see the bigger picture. And that's something we can all relate to. How often do we get tunnel vision in life, where all we see is the finish line, and we miss the warning signs along the way? Whether it's in our relationships, our careers, or even our faith, there are always moments when we're too caught up in our own ambition to notice that we might be heading for trouble. Here's where the real reflection begins. What are the moments in your life where you've been blind to something important? Maybe it's something that's been right in front of you all along, but like Balaam, you were too focused on the wrong thing to see it. Maybe there's a donkey in your life, a voice or a situation trying to steer you in the right direction, but you've been too stubborn to listen. Trust me, we've all been there. It could be that friend who's been warning you about a bad decision, or maybe it's a subtle nudge from your own intuition that you've been ignoring. I've had those moments too, where I thought I knew best, only to find out later that the signs were all there. I just wasn't paying attention. And when you finally realize it, it's almost like a facepalm moment. You think, how did I not see that before? But the good news is, like Balaam, we all have the chance to turn things around. So here's a call to action for all of us. Take a moment to think about the donkeys in your life, the unlikely sources of wisdom, guidance, and truth. It could be your pet that reminds you to slow down and enjoy the little things in life, or maybe it's that random conversation with a stranger that gave you a fresh perspective. We never know where life's greatest lessons will come from, but one thing's for sure, they often come from the most unexpected places. And hey, let's not take ourselves too seriously either. We can learn these lessons while still having a sense of humor about it. Maybe next time your cat knocks something off the counter, it's the universe reminding you to stop being so stressed about keeping everything in order. Or when your toddler says something so simple but so profound, it's a reminder that wisdom doesn't always come from the experts, but often from the innocence and honesty of those around us. The key message here is that when we open our eyes to the signs around us, when we allow ourselves to be guided by the wisdom of others, even the ones we least expect, we can avoid the dangers of stubbornness and grow in ways we never thought possible. Balaam's story could have ended in disaster, but because he finally listened, he was able to change his course. And that's the takeaway for all of us. It's never too late to open our eyes and make a change. So as we wrap this up, let's all think about the ways we can let go of our own stubbornness and embrace the guidance we've been given. Whether it's from a friend, a family member, or even an unexpected situation, there's wisdom waiting for us if we're just willing to listen. And who knows, you might find your next big aha moment in the most unlikely place. Remember, sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most surprising sources. So keep your eyes open, your heart humble, and be ready to receive wisdom, even if it comes from a talking donkey. That's it, everyone. What do you think of Balaam's journey and the surprising wisdom he found along the way? Was it the talking donkey that struck you most? Or maybe the deeper lesson of learning to listen to those unexpected voices in our lives? I know we've all had moments where we've been so focused on our own goals that we miss the signs right in front of us. Let me know which part of the story hit home for you. Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Also, I'd love to hear if there's another story from the Bible that you'd like to dive into next. Whether it's about unexpected messengers, moments of repentance, or the twists and turns in someone's journey of faith, drop your suggestions and we'll explore them together. Your feedback and ideas are what keep this community thriving, so don't hesitate to share what's on your mind. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories and insights like this one. Every week, we take a fresh look at timeless tales that challenge us to think deeper and live better. So if you don't want to miss the next story that could change the way you see things, make sure to hit the notification bell too. Until next time, stay curious, stay open, and remember, sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from the most unexpected places. Keep your heart and mind open, because you never know when your next talking donkey moment might happen.